and welcome to the brand new Samson Historical YouTube channel. We're happy to meet with you here every Wednesday at 4 p.m. where we can talk about 18th century life and material culture. I'm your host, Abby Samson, and thank you so much for joining me here in our study this afternoon. We're really excited to be able to use this space to, like I said, discuss all kinds of things related to the 18th century. So I can't wait to share what we know with you and hear what you guys have to say. First, I want to kind of direct you around our space briefly. We've taken so much care in deciding and honestly had a lot of fun in deciding what to use, from the original furniture to the blue paint on the wall, which actually dates back to the second oldest home in Williamsburg, down to the nails that we used for the floor. So we'll go into that at a later date and show you around kind of these details. But first and foremost, thank you for being here with me. We know that the 18th century is a passion for a lot of you. And we hope that you guys realize that's a big part of who we are. And that includes even our personal interests and collections. So today, to get us kicked off, I want to talk about something that's really personal to me. And that would be 18th century clay pipes. And I know that sounds weird, but if you've been with us from our Facebook journey to reliving history to now, you've probably heard me talk about them. And I'm going to explain why I find them just absolutely fascinating, and hopefully you will too. So to get us started, let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of the pipe. So as we're going through this, you know what kind of parts we're talking about here. So why this is important is because we're going to be discussing a lot of different aspects, from the stem to whether they have to whether they have the mouthpiece, the way that they're formed, all of this. So just take a look at this quick diagram that we have up here. And then the reason that these are so interesting is because they were really largely ignored up till the 1950s, even though they are found at nearly every historical site where people occupied through the colonial period, the 17th and the 18th century, on through the 19th century, but we get a little bit out of my specialty there, so we'll stick with 18th. And the first person who really made an effort to accurately date these was Adrian Oswald. And before him, we had some attempts in the 1860s to date these pipes, and a lot of them focused on the shape of the bowl and how that changes over time. So as you can see here, you have the different shapes and the different cants of the bowl. One thing that you'll notice in that upper left-hand corner is that the pipe sits straight up, and then as it goes down later, it cants out. What's interesting is that that's actually opposite of what's true for English clay pipes. What's not really being taken into consideration here would be kind of local variations, or whether they were Dutch, or any of these different factors. So what we're talking about here really is only attributable to 18th century English clay pipes. And that becomes important in colonial America later on. But Adrian Oswald was a wonderful curator. During the bombing of London in World War II, a lot of things were being unearthed. And when that happened, he was looking at this strata, so these layers. Think of it like a cake. You have these different layers, but each one is a time frame. And so he started grouping these pipes by bowl shape and maker's marks and things like that, and realizing that they existed in these specific levels together. And so he actually published in 1948 a paper to that effect, and it was revolutionary. So after 1950, we start to see an increase in the understanding, or the want to understand, these historical pipes. So you have a lot of debate, even still today. It has not been settled by any means. I think Ivor Noel Hume, who is a wonderful archaeologist, in a paper of his, he wrote that more ink has been devoted to dating tobacco pipes than any other artifact category. And that is absolutely true in my opinion, because we can't even figure out, honestly, different dating methods for things like pipe stems. And that's very important. So what I'm going to give you right now is going to be pretty heavy for the next minute. If you want to look at these resources, those will be listed below. A lot of the sources that I used to compile this information and corroborate information. So there is an article in those links for a thesis by Laura K. McMillan. And these equations that I'm going to give you, she actually lists all of them. And so you'll be able to see those more accurately. For those of you that have been with us for a while, you're well aware I am more of a writer than a mathematician. So I'm actually going to refer to my notes for these because I don't want to get these wrong. So you have the Harrington method in 1954, the first attempt to take pipe stems and group them into actual categories and time frames. So to use the Harrington method, you have to take a bundle of 10 and use the borehole. And so if you remember from our diagram, the borehole is simply the hole that runs through the pipe from the tip to the stem. And he used drill bits at 1/64 diameters and increase them and use that to measure the borehole. So we have this, and the problem with that is you have things like shrinkage and all these different things, weathering, that can affect that borehole size over time. But building on him, we have the Binford method in 1962. And so that is still widely used. This is the one that's still considered commonly acceptable. And a really cool thing, actually, earlier I was reading an archaeological report, and I saw the Binford method and another method we're going to talk about here in a second, both referenced, and the time frame that they came up with was actually like spot on with each other. They corroborated each other, so that was really cool. But he expands on the Harrington method with a formula. So he applies straight line regression to the relative percentage method. For you math brain people, again, check out Laura's documentation on those equations. The problem with his method is that at the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century, as things really start to get kind of mixed up, it loses a lot of accuracy. But in 17th century sites and early 18th century sites, it's incredibly helpful. And the study that I was reading earlier was actually an early 18th century site, so it was perfect and it was very accurate in that instance. Following that, we have the Lee-Hansen method, where he's actually contemporary of Binford's, and so he takes Binford's one single equation and says, that's great, but what if we use 10? So he comes together with these 10 formulas, bases it off of Harrington's original method, but that he actually ends up kind of redacting and says, well, Binford just told me I was wrong. So he pulls back that research. But then you have the Heighton-Deegan method in 72. That'd be 1972. And that says that diameter should be applied to a curvilinear line. And that's done with a two-part equation, a logarithmic formula, and a point of origin formula. So there is a lot going on there in how to date pipes by stems. Bowls are by far easier, but there are more stems available. And the bowls are easier because you have maker's marks. And so that starts to come into play with what's called the Worshipful Company of Tobacco Pipe Makers and Tobacco Blenders. And that's established with the guild system in England. And so in 1619, by royal charter granted by King James I, you have this guild system come up. And the guild system applies rules and regulations, and this is specific to London and pipes that are going in and out of London and being produced there. And so you have these maker's marks identifying who is producing them. And with that, you can look at production dates and who's in business when and with who and who they're doing business with. And so that allows a lot of opportunity to date that way. So if you can have that, that's wonderful. We'll take a look at some maker's marks here in a minute. But you don't necessarily always have every maker's mark available to you. Oswald did a lot of work categorizing and sketching different maker's marks. So that is still applicable today. His research in many ways is still upheld, especially his research cataloging maker's marks out of London. And I did include a link to some of those as well. It's many pamphlets wide. So make sure if you have pipes that you're looking to date, that you get a general idea of kind of the age before you start digging, or you're going to be there a very long time. Believe me, I've been down this rabbit hole, and in a lot of ways, I'm still stuck there. But there is a brief time from 1643 to 1663 where that charter was disbanded. They didn't pay, there was a civil war, and so that charter was then disbanded and then reinstated. So bowls are considered the most accurate dating method by far. And I've got actually some of my personal examples here that I'd love to show you, and the reason why. So this is one of my favorites here. As you can see, it has a beautiful maker's mark, and this is the spur that they're talking about. And so this spur here has a mark here as well as here. Then you also have heel marks like this one here. So you've got this flat space. All right, and then when we're looking at older pipes, one way to really tell that you have a pre-1730 pipe would be this milling at the top here. So you've got this kind of gradation here, and that's called a bottomed rim, which is where this has been taken out of the mold. And we know it was molded because you have the line here. And there was a tool pushed in and spun around to kind of clear out this space. So that was during production, and that's, again, a pre-1730 style of manufacturing. We've got a lot of pipes here, so I'm going to keep them organized. So as time goes on, you have this introduction of taller bowls and thinner walls. And so you have your very old 17th century pipes that have these very thick bellies on them. Whereas you get into 18th century and it's almost this china thin. It's beautiful, it's delicate, it feels delicate in your hand, and everything in between. So you have that's closer to the 19th century, but this here, that's a beautiful mid-century pipe that has this nice thick wall. And we see a lot of those reproduced still today. And so even into the 19th century, you get into more decorative pipes, and that bowl starts to shorten again. So if you're looking at your maker's marks and you have heel stamps, those are going to be primarily pre-1730, and then molded marks. So ones that we have here that I was showing you, that first one with that beautiful little crown and little lamp and teapot, that's a very solid later 18th century pipe, so post 1750. That's really my personal wheelhouse, and those are my personal favorites. So anytime I can find something like that, I know I'm really in my specialty, and it's very, very exciting. If you have one that has an actual stamp on it, so like a colored stamp, that's probably 19th century. It doesn't really come in until the early 1800s in like wide array. So a lot of times when I'm out and about and I'm talking to people and we're talking about pipes, they'll say, oh, are these Meerschaum pipes? The answer is no. So if you know what Meerschaum is, it's actually its own mineral entirely. It's called hydrous magnesium silicate. So we're getting into math and science today. But that particular medium was not popular. It came from Turkey. It was found in small batches, and it didn't make it into Britain even until 1800. So you have this little bit going on in the Mediterranean where these are being traded, still not in vast quantities as far as I'm aware. So these, all that we're talking about, are ball clay or pipe clay or English pipe clay. And the cool thing about that is it's been used for pipes for a very long time. And the difference is, so this is found in large masses in different parts of England. So you have quantities of it being made in areas almost exclusively into pipes, but then you get out into some kind of the provincial areas that may not have access to this resource. And when you do that, you start to see things like inclusions into this clay. So maybe a combination or maybe an entirely different type of clay altogether. And you'll know that if you're looking at a stem and you see sediment in it, that is not this fine ball clay, or it's had inclusions in it and it's a lesser quality pipe. All things to consider. What I think is neat is if you can find a pipe that fits a guild mark, so a maker's mark of somebody who was in the guild, and you see inclusions in it, and you know that you were cutting your clay with something, and it's a cost savings. So that was not allowed. You're not allowed to do that. That is poor craftsmanship, according to the standards. So after you get through the 1750s, you have this broader ability to transport these large quantities of clay. And then these large production places that are outside of the locality of those deposits, they continue to produce these types of pipes now, these ball clay pipes, which is great because that makes pipes cheaper, which is perfect timing because at this point we are looking at tobacco prices fluctuating. So the process of making these, now that we have this ball clay and it's accessible to everybody everywhere, and again, we're making these in England and exporting them into the colonies, so everywhere in England. You start by rolling out your clay to fit your mold. So you're making a stem. You have a 2-part mold that comes together like this. So you make a roll to make your stem, and then a wider end to be left for your bowl here. And so you put this into the mold. You run a wire through it that has a little nub at the end, and what that does is it clears out and bores out that tube on the inside, and you have a plug piece that's put in here to mold the inside of the bowl. And so while that is done, those are then let to dry a little while, come out of the mold, and then go into a firing process. So a really cool thing, molds are most of the time made out of cast iron. There is evidence of one wooden mold that I'm aware of. If you find more evidence of wooden molds or other materials, absolutely let me know. There's always information coming up about pipes. They're finding new manufacturing places. But here in America, there was actually a pipe maker named Emmanuel Drew. And while he was not making the ball clay pipes, he was making what's called a Chesapeake pipe, which has a different body and a different makeup. And there's actually a link to the Chipstone Foundation and an article that's there on this specific site. And he was operating late 17th century, but his molds, after he died, it listed 2 brass pipe molds. So that makes sense to me because we have, if you look at different like casting molds for metal, you have cast iron, you have brass, and that's a pretty common thing. So that I would say that is logically sound. That makes sense. And but the wooden molds, not a lot of those. There's obviously potential reasons for that, degradation, things like that. So if you find more evidence of those, please let me know. Everything I found has been cast iron or, again, these brass molds. So how are they fired? Well, they're fired in a funny little thing called a muffle. So it goes in a kiln, just like any other type of clay or pottery. And this is actually a sketch specifically of Emmanuel Drew's muffle. And that it just sounds funny. So this is a higher temperature clay. So what you'd have like your cups and bowls and such made out of, that fires at a much higher temperature, and it's harder. And so it goes inside of the kiln, and it protects, and it is sealed and protects those white clay pipes from anything that could happen, like gases or like discoloration. And kind of a cool thing, obviously, if you are an artisan still and you make anything, you try to be as frugal as possible. So they're doing this production. And sometimes things break. Pipes break. If you fire pottery, sometimes something cracks, something breaks, something goes wrong. And so that muffle actually is a permanent fixture in the kiln, but it is resealed very, very frequently in a wattle and daub kind of style, but they're using broken pipe stems and laying them in there and then laying over that to keep that structure. So just kind of a cool reuse of materials there that I find personally very interesting. I don't know, it may not be, but that kind of ingenuity. And so we also have this other method of firing, and it's in something called a sager. And that sager or sagger, it's a large ceramic vessel again. It has a hole in the base, and pipes are put in there in kind of a ring style with their stems pointing up and through the hole, and then you can actually stack them. And the cool thing about the sager is it can be used to make what's called a carbon pipe. And a carbon pipe is a black pipe, a black clay pipe. It's made out of the exact same English pipe clay that the white pipes are made of, but at this point they're filling the sager with sawdust, and they're sealing it up and removing all of the oxygen from that environment. And this black is soaking into the pipes as they're fired and as they are burned. So it's really neat. But the reason we don't find a lot of those is not that we're not finding pipes that were black clay pipes. It's that a lot of times can look like iron inclusion, like dirt. If you find something that's been exposed to water for a long time, that's washing out that extra carbon that's been put into that material, exposed to high heat outside of that firing process. That again will lighten it, and it just kind of looks dirty. So without carbon dating, it's very hard to figure out if that was a black clay pipe, if it's been exposed to the elements, if it's a dug pipe. So that is a lot of the how and kind of the why of the pipes. But one of the things that's really interesting would be the types of designs that we find. If you're like me, you're a very visual person, and I find it really neat to look at the things that were very common items and figure out why is that thing. So you have military influence. I have a pipe here that has British military influence and has natives on it. You have nautical influence. That's always a very popular theme. Some of them are downright dirty, and we aren't going to go into that here. That is something you can look up on your own time. But fables and mythology, George Washington in the Midden, the trash pit that was dug there, and they had found several pipes that have the fox and the grapes from Aesop's fables. So I think the coolest, though, is the tavern pipes, or the pipes that are made for taverns specifically, that they had made with their crest or their sign or their kind of logo on. So it denoted where it came from. And that's just super neat to me, that you have businesses then, and you're kind of using this advertising. We'll talk a little bit about why that's important to taverns here in a minute. But you have pipes as a cultural phenomenon. They are used by absolutely everybody. And with that, you have, as the price of tobacco changes and shifts, you have the 17th century where tobacco is very pricey. And then you get into the 18th century where this is going down, this price is going down. And that's because you have these colonies that are using enslaved labor to produce cheap tobacco. And that's being sent over to England and being traded for and sold there in higher quantities, as well as being sold here at, again, vast quantities at a lower price. So you have all of this changing, this, again, cultural thing where you have soldiers that have tobacco pipes. It's available, it's cheap, it's ready. And so that's why we see the shift in bowl size. So you have the 16th century pipes that have this really small bowl here. This is probably my earliest pipe that I have, but it's very, very small. And you compare it to a late 18th century pipe here, and we'll pull this up on the camera so you can see it a little bit better. And the size difference is shocking. And it's not just in the wall, it's in the bowl as well. So leave those there. And you have this shift in accessories also. You have things like tobacco boxes here. This is a wonderful little brass reproduction. And so you can see the difference in how much this is going to hold compared to the size of the bowl. So you have this one here that is significantly larger. This is your later 18th century pipe versus your 17th century pipe. And it's much smaller. You have a very thick wall here. That's what's keeping this bowl safe in the heat difference. But there's a lot of changes in things like accessories. Like I said, you have snuff boxes, which is a whole nother video in itself. Snuff was a total phenomenon for men and women, and it was a lot more elite, not necessarily like upper class, but the upper middle, when snuff was truly popular, as far as my recollection. But you have these pipes that are being used by everybody. So if you want to look at some really cool things like the Ember Tongs, which is one of my favorite accessories. It's just the small little pair of tongs like you'd use for cooking. And if you want to look at average everyday people in specifically the Dutch in the late 17th and very, very early 18th centuries, they painted everything. Just common people doing common things all everywhere. And they have these little bowls that are ember bowls. And what they do is they're taking these tongs, or like this here, which is, again, another type of ember tong, and they're picking up, like we saw the picture of the soldier do, and they're holding that coal into their pipe. So I very much lose a lot of time looking at old Dutch paintings, just because the idea of valuing the common person, where you have not a lot of English and American representation of this pipe smoking, because they didn't paint as much of the average in that ordinary life, and it was more extraordinary. And so that's just it's kind of a neat rabbit hole we've gone down together. Thank you for being there for that. But when I'm saying everybody smokes a pipe, that includes even enslaved people, and not everywhere, not on every plantation, but there is evidence to say that small plain pipes were purchased on these tobacco plantations because, again, they're very cheap and passed out or sold to enslaved persons there. So there's conjecture that that's kind of an effort to maintain this kind of utopian feel, but they're absolutely everywhere. And you have actually tobacco still from those cultures, and a lot of the pipes that we see that come over with African culture actually were stone pipes, so not as often with the clay, which is why those clay pipes would have been something that would have been provided versus created in this style. We actually we don't have evidence specifically of George Washington doing this, but we do have evidence of his pipe orders, and he was ordering a lot of pipes. He actually placed multiple orders. But in an invoice with Robert Carey & Co., you can see where he purchased 25 gross of pipes, and those would have been, it's a lot of numbers. He had 144 of the best long kind for the pipes, and then almost 3,000 common pipes. That's a lot. That is a significant amount of pipes, and he's trading his tobacco for these items. But those long pipes, what we can kind of assume is that those are talking about what we consider to be a tavern style pipe. So something like this here. And these would have been to impress people. This is a luxury item, but because it's very fragile and they don't travel well, to be honest with you. And so versus like something where you have like this, where you've got a much shorter stem, a lot less breakage, but those long pipes are something that are being used to impress people. like I said, they're a leisure item. There's actually a wonderful painting of Mr. Oldham and guests, and it's by J. Highmore. Here it is here. And you can see you've got that long tavern pipe. This is a group of wealthy men. And actually, Joseph Highmore is the one in the purple. So this gathering of friends here. And he has this tavern pipe with this dip tip end. And so the reason for that tipped end is, again, it's this luxury item. So this clay is actually very porous, like we talked about earlier. So if you were to put it in your mouth and your lips are wet, it's going to stick to your mouth, and that's uncomfortable. So you have either a harder clay on the outside, wax, potentially a type of glaze that it could be dipped in on the end. I did find one source that said milk, and I'd like to look into more of that. That sounded weird, and I didn't unfortunately have time to look more into that, but very much wetting it would have made it easier and more enjoyable. But I've never, had somebody been, around somebody smoking a pipe and they had a large glass of milk with them. So it seems like an odd choice, but definitely wax and different fired clays and glazes were used. So the reason that this is such a luxury item is because the smoke tastes different. In this shorter pipe, you have, it's still very hot when it gets to your mouth. The longer pipe, you have this much cooler smoke. You're getting different flavors and tones. So these were actually popular in taverns. That's why we get the tavern pipe. Pardon me. So what they're using here, this long pipe, you can go into a tavern. You don't have to own one of these yourself. You can go into a tavern. You can purchase for use a tavern pipe. And we're going to talk about a little myth that drives me absolutely crazy when I hear it, because it doesn't make sense. And we know kind of how it started, but people have got to stop perpetuating it. So they did not break off the end of a stem and pass the pipe around and break it off in between people. There's no reason to do that. So you may pass around a pipe, but you know what happens if you drop it at a tavern as you and your friends are all drinking and discussing things in heated fashion? It's going to break into several different pieces. And so, especially in an environment like that. But we have these items here, these kind of cages that I have on the table here, and I have an original one here, which was a lovely anniversary present. Gentlemen, just remember, girls love pipe kilns. So what this does is, it would have been used at a tavern to clean out the stem. So again, they don't need to break them because they're being put in this rack here. And this is being put in the fire, and they're burning out any type of like debris or anything that's inside of it. They're getting it, it's nice and clean. The understanding of germs was very, very different in the period. So aside from general grossness, they're not burning away the germs in this instance. So this really helped the longevity of those pipes. So those taverns, those people that are making money off of selling one or two smokes out of these types of pipes, they're protecting their investment. They're expensive. Washington's only buying a small amount of these relatively. So this is a really cool piece, and these would have been made out of iron. And you have this hook to be able to raise and lower it. You also have holes on the sides to be able to put smaller pipes in there and balance them and let them burn out that way as well. So just a neat utilitarian item. So first off, I want to thank you for staying with me through my very long-winded kind of obsession with these items. They're so interesting to me because they're so common, and I personally have this fascination with what was average. We have the extraordinary. The extraordinaries in museums. What was average? What was there? What did everybody see? What did my ancestors have? And so this is something that, again, is very, very near and dear to my heart. Next week, I'm really looking forward to seeing you here Wednesday again at 4 p.m. in our study. And we're going to talk about something that is a little bit more of the extraordinary, that made news and headlines, not only in England, but also here in colonial America. And that would be the bizarre tale of Mary Toft, the mother of rabbits. So that, if you look it up ahead of time, believe me, there's still more. With this story, there's always more. Before we go, I do want to take a second and remember a wonderful, wonderful woman. And she's very important to us here at Samson Historical. She created the Turkey Roost line, and that would be Annie Metz. And she unfortunately did pass away, and she's going to be very missed. She and her mother Verna both did so much for 18th century clothing and 19th century clothing, and bringing those pieces back to life. And so just our thoughts and prayers are with her family and everybody, because she will be very missed. And the historical community lost a wonderful researcher with a wonderful heart. So sorry to end on a little bit of, on a sad note, but what she should always be remembered for are the wonderful, wonderful pieces that she created, and that she has helped us to get to where we are today, in appreciating that research as well. So thank you all so much for being here. I'll see you again next Wednesday at 4 p.m. And we'll talk about Mary Toft and that whole journey. But make sure to subscribe and like and comment. If you have questions, give us those. If you have comments and if you have research, let us know that. Check out all of the links to all of the research we presented here, and we'll see you next week.